Welcome back to State of the Nation tonight with me, Matt Goodwin. So, is the Labour Party running scared from Nigel Farage and reform? GBNews' political editor Christopher Hope highlighted this question from today's Prime Minister's questions in Parliament. Check it out.
The honourable member for Clacton says that his party is, and I quote, open to anything when it comes to changing our NHS and open to an insurance-based system.
What a contrast with Reform, whose leader has said that those who can afford to pay should pay for our healthcare. But under Labour, the NHS will always be free at the point of use for anyone who needs it.
That was Rugby MP John Slinger asking a lightly planted question as a means of trying to rattle Reform. Here was Nigel Farage's question today as well. Check this out.
If I can assure the honourable member for Rugby that Reform want healthcare to be free at the point of delivery... There appears to be some panic on that side of the House. I'm not surprised.
And let's be honest, the Labour Party should be panicking about the rise of reform. Up until now, the government's policy on reform has been to effectively pretend that it doesn't exist and deflect criticism towards the Conservative Party. But that strategy no longer works. Reform UK, as we've seen in the polls over the last week, is now number one. It's just polled 25%, with YouGov to Labour's 24% and the Tories way back on 21%. The government today is now panicking because it senses that the real opposition isn't coming from the official opposition party, the Conservative Party, but is coming instead from Reform. And today's events in Parliament barely scratch the surface. The Guardian, for example, has reported today that a backbench group of Labour MPs are now applying pressure on Keir Starmer and his government to get immigration under control because their seats are under threat from reform. Indeed, The Guardian reported today that Downing Street has dispatched data and strategy experts to advise Labour MPs on issues that are resonating with reform voters. Now, look, if you take a look at the top 10 seats that are under threat from reform, and I've shown this in my own analysis, they go all the way to the top of the Labour Party. They include people like Energy Secretary Ed Miliband, Defence Secretary John Healey, Health Minister Stephen Kinnock, even Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. So what are the key issues reform voters really care about? Well, we know that they really care about immigration. They want legal immigration lowered and they want illegal immigration stopped. So what has Labour promised on these issues? Well, look at legal immigration. The answer is very little beyond a few platitudes about bringing the numbers down without mentioning a cap at all and reducing reliance on foreign labour. But what has Labour promised on illegal migration? Well, the answer, as we covered last week, is that actually they've decriminalised illegal migration. They've opened the floodgates. They've given people more incentives to come to the UK illegally. The key point here is that Labour simply doesn't have the will to resolve the issues that matter to reform voters, that matter to the country. In other words, the Reform Party isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and it only shows signs of continuing to lead the national polls and change the national conversation. Now, as ever, let me know your views at gbnews.com/yoursay or tweet me at X at GoodwinMJ. But right now, I'm joined by the trade unionist, and the writer Paul Embury. Paul, you have an intimate understanding of the Labour Party and the people who have been moving from the Labour Party over the last decade or so over to Nigel Farage, to UKIP, the Brexit Party, and now Reform. Let me just ask you a very simple question. Do you think, after all that time, after the last 15 years or so, do you think the Labour Party really gets the scale of the threat that's about to come to the Labour Party at the next general election from Nigel Farage and Reform?
Well, good evening, Matt. I think some of them do. We've seen this Red Wall caucus of MPs who I think have correctly identified the threat from reform in their constituencies. They know it's important to get immigration numbers down. They know it's important to get economic growth. They understand the importance of reducing NHS waiting lists, tackling the housing crisis and so on, making sure there's a fair transition on net zero. So I think it's heartening for somebody on the left like me to know that there are people within the Labour Party who get that. But look, let's not make any mistake, there are lots of people in the party and the wider Labour movement, including the trade unions, who are very uncomfortable with all of this stuff. They reject what they see as, you know, this sort of right-wing agenda, as they would call it. But unfortunately, it's those people who are largely responsible for millions of working-class voters abandoning the Labour Party over recent years. So, you know, when it comes to whether or not they point the way forward, I would argue very much that they don't.
I mean, Paul, the way I see it is mass immigration is going to become the new Brexit in this country. The 75% of Brits are really concerned about the scale of migration. They want it reduced. They want the borders controlled. And that issue is going to cut across the Labour Party support in the Red Wall, in Wales, in the North East, North West, and also in some Tory areas. I don't really think Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper get how serious this is for the Labour Party. I mean, if you look at the seats that are most vulnerable to reform, if you look at the top 100, 64 of them, as I've shown this week, 64 of them are held by the Labour Party.
Indeed, and many of them in the north of England, what you might call Labour's traditional territory. It's working class heartlands once upon a time. And look, Matt, I grew up in the London borough of Barking and Dagenham. We saw the BNP surge in that borough. In 2006, they won 12 seats on the local council, their best ever result in local government. So I know why traditional Labour voters turn to right-wing parties. It's because ultimately they feel abandoned. If you're on the left, if you're a centre-left party and you don't deliver economic justice and economic security, and if at the same time you compromise people's what you might call their cultural security. So if you're responsible for, you know, deindustrialisation, rapid demographic change in their communities and so on, you will get blowback inevitably. And we saw that at the turn of the century when the new global market, if you like, was really starting to take hold in some of these communities. And those economic changes and those cultural changes, people saw, you know, the effects of social disintegration, the undermining of social solidarity. They saw thousands of solid blue-collar jobs in once safe industries disappear abroad. The Labour Party should be doing something about that. And for the last 20 years or so, I don't think it's understood it.
Well, Paul Embry, thank you for raising that issue, because I can turn now to former Labour advisor Matthew Torbet. I mean, you've advised the Labour Party in the past. Imagine you were advising them, you know, today. What would you be telling them about how to stop the rise of reform?
I think the two key things that voters from the opinion polls seem to be worried about is immigration and the NHS. That's still the two top things. So you need a strategy for the NHS. That if people feel like they're being seen on time, they're less frustrated with life, they feel like life is better, that's one thing. But I think from a strategy point of view, you need to stop people turning on their TVs and seeing people cross the channel. That's the stuff that winds people up.
OK, but we know Labour's plan, let's be frank, we know Labour, they're not going to stop the boats.
No, I think, but there is an option to, and there was in 2021. In 2021, the French Interior Minister said to Boris Johnson, you need to have a safe and legal route now, because it's not helping us, it's not helping you. Ultimately, people are dying in the Channel. What he offered was for them to be processed in Calais. Therefore, they're not getting to the country. Current asylum law says that you have to present yourself in Britain to claim asylum. And that way, if they're not staying here, they're staying with the French. But you're ultimately stopping people. And having a safe and legal route means you're negating the need for them to cross.
But this is where I feel like I'm going loopy, right? So I know that people like you will be telling Keir Starmer, look, you've got to solve this issue. They'll be telling Yvette Cooper, you're going to lose your seat if you don't solve this issue. And I think Yvette Cooper she may lose her seat. So why on earth has Labour just decriminalised illegal migration? Why is it giving people more incentives to come into the country? This is what I don't understand. Do they just not care about what's going to happen to the Red Wall and Wales at the next election?
Well, I think they will be concerned, and, you know, I think people are starting to slowly wake up. I said on election night on a different TV channel, this is the best it will get. This election win is the best it will get for 5 years, and you're going to have to try and get through it, because we've been left with a car crash, but also there's a hell of a lot to get in front of.
Yeah.
And if that election had gone on for another 4 weeks, I think Nigel Farage and Reform would have doubled their MPs.
Simon Danchuk, you've got a lot of experience with these kinds of voters. You've got experience with Labour, with Reform. You know, I looked at the numbers this week, the top seats for Reform at the next election. As I said, of the top 100, 64 are Labour held. Of the top 50, 33 are Labour held. I mean, if Starmer's not careful, this kind of bazooka is just going to smash apart the red wall, you know, Labour heartlands in Wales. I mean, is there anything you think that Labour can do to stop this from happening?
Well, there's no doubt about it. Labour MPs are running scared from Reform. There's no doubt about that. The morale within amongst Labour MPs is at rock bottom. They are talking confidentially about replacing Starmer within the next 2 years.
Well, it's now dripping into the papers.
Absolutely. That's openly being spoken about by Labour MPs. And some of the new Labour MPs are just astonished at the amount of vitriol, quite rightly, they're getting from their electorate. So they're running scared from Reform. And the other point is, we talk about this group that's come together and said, oh, you know, this group of Labour MPs, we want to be tougher on migration. The problem there is it's all about self-preservation. It's not because they believe it, it's because they want to hold on to the seats. And you were right, it's in red wall seats. This is where they're under threat. There's going to be some real changes. There'll be a lot less Labour MPs at the next general election. No doubt about that.
My thesis here is basically the political realignment that we saw with Brexit is ongoing. The only difference is it's Reform, not the Tories, who are becoming the big beneficiary of that. That they are now scooping up, as we saw with YouGov this week, half of all Brexit voters. They're the most popular party among men. They're the most popular party among the working class. I mean, I don't think, speaking to MPs on the Labour side at least, that they have any real comprehension of just how big this thing could get.
Absolutely, and some people in politics have been talking about a cap or a limit on how popular Reform can go. I don't think there is a cap on it. I think they can go well into the 30s. Well into the 30s. They've 200,000 members. I've just come from a meeting in Chelsea, Reform meeting. Absolutely.
Chelsea.
Absolutely packed out. You're standing room only.
Listen,
everywhere.
Look, you know, I speak at a few of them, but let's say, right, OK, Labour, you have to put a game plan together. This is how you stop Reform between now and 2029, right? What's on the recipe? I would say leave the ECHR, reform the Human Rights Act, announce a cap on immigration, you know, reinvest the money we're wasting on foreign aid, 15.3 billion a year. Let's start chucking that at the NHS. Let's start helping British people before we start helping the world. I mean, what is the kind of anti-reform message? Because I just don't see anything coming from Labour.
It should be what they were standing on, and I think this is where the frustration comes from. The seats you've just cited are all held by cabinet members whose seats voted leave at the referendum.
And I know they know this, by the way. No, I've talked to them about it. I mean, John Healey, people like that, they know this is going to happen.
And this is the thing. So people feel left behind. That was a big part of the Brexit vote. What Labour went into the last election saying was change. We had a one-word slogan, change, and at the moment, people still feel left behind. They feel more hard done than ever, and if you're not going to do the bread and butter of the NHS and the economy, then I'm afraid we're going to lose our majority at the next election. Simple as that.
Yeah, well, unbelievable scenes in the polling, that's for sure, and I think it's going to continue for some time. Thank you to my panel.